this isn't one party. We talked about college universities a moment ago. Believe me, I find Judaism is in a very tough position. On the left, on the right, they like this idea of they're being replaced, that it's about a white genocide. On the left, it's about white privilege. Jews end up in both cases getting stuck with it. On the right, they're seen as the people who are part of the white genocide, and on the left, they're seen as the people who have white privilege.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, so this panel, we're going to focus on the psychology of a jihadist. Right now, in that, I have two very distinguished guests. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. The first one is Dr. Mathew Schumacher. Now, you can see Dr. Mathew Schumacher. That's the type of dog that only a military guy would have, certainly. Nobody's going to mess with you with that. But he is a distinguished national security psychologist, and he was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. He has a decade of experience in military operations focused on psychology and leadership consultation with multiple deployments to Iraq, Africa, Afghanistan, including in support of special forces operations in the intelligence community. He's also an expert in military and national security psychology, psychological response to disasters, and psychiatric emergencies. And he has a robust experience teaching medical, special operations, intelligence, and law enforcement personnel. In 2015, he was the first officer to complete the Navy's Joint Interagency Operational Psychology Fellowship, sponsored by DevGru, is that how you say that? DevGru, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. From 2013 to 2018, he was an assistant professor of psychiatry at the Uniformed Service University of Health Services, teaching and supervising psychologists and psychiatrists, inpatient and emergency psychiatry, deployment psychology, and crisis disaster response. He ended his military career with the Marine Corps Special Operations Command, MARSOC, as an embedded operational psychologist in April of 2018. He is fully qualified SEER psychologist and has held a TSSCI clearance and qualified to support high-value detainee interrogations, HIG. He's trained or deployed with special units of USASOC. I'm not going to name all of these acronyms. There's an alphabet soup of them. But I can tell you he has a lot of experience in this field, and we're excited to have you.
That was just a psychological test to see how you could do.
I'll fail those, yes. That's not going to work well for me. All right, now.
You know you're important when you can't talk about what you do, and you've got top secret clearance.
Now, I could do this next introduction off the top of my head, but then I would miss something and I would hear about it later because the next person I'm introducing is my significant other. But Dr. Emily Bashah is a licensed psychologist who operates in private practice in Scottsdale, Arizona, with Bashah Psychological Services, where she offers expertise in value high-profile legal cases. Those include domestic terrorism and first-degree murder. Dr. Bashah's personal history deeply informs her personal focus, and she is the daughter of Iraqi Jews, two people who I love very much, Evelyn and Joe, who fled persecution under Saddam Hussein. It is a narrative that I can promise you has had a profound effect on shaping how she thinks. Her work extends beyond her practice into the literary world, and she and I co-authored a book called Addictive Ideologies, which you'll find in your package. Addictive Ideologies, Finding Meaning and Agency When Politics Fails You. In that book, everything that you will read that is scientific, factual, and accurate is hers. All the rest is mine. But nonetheless, we outline the dangers of ideologies that it poses to individual agency and liberty, and her examination of radical ideologies is informed not just by academic research, but obviously by her family's history. Now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to start this with Dr. Schumacher. And the question that I would like to ask, you've spent time, after leaving the military, you spent time working on domestic terrorism. What I'd like to know from you is, what is the connection between domestic terrorism and anti-Semitism?
Sure. So I suppose setting the stage here, one thing to get straight up front is the point of terrorism the violence that they do, or is it the way they make people feel and behave? Domestic terrorism, such that it's connected to the Middle East, is all about influence and persuasion. Right? And what I think we're seeing a lot of right now is obviously division and folks that are being dragged down certain roads. The anti-Semitic one is probably the oldest of the old roads that people are led to hate. So we've got a lot of folks that are coming from a lot of different perspectives. So we've got white supremacists and folks like that who end up being anti-Semitic. We have jihadists and folks from the Middle East in background that are Muslim-based, ends up being anti-Semitic. And now we arguably have some things going on the far left in America. So in a lot of ways, all roads lead to anti-Semitism, which is hard to explain, but it seems to be the way this world works.
If we can, we have a video, I believe, that we can show you, done by the Jewish Federation. Can we play that? Here's the point of that film. The point of that film is, this isn't one party. We talked about college universities a moment ago. Believe me, I find Judaism is in a very tough position. On the left, on the right, they like this idea of they're being replaced, that it's about a white genocide. On the left, it's about white privilege. Jews end up in both cases getting stuck with it. On the right, they're seen as the people who are part of the white genocide, and on the left, they're seen as the people who have white privilege. Right? The point is this, that this issue is something that goes beyond politics. It just does. And if you try to put this into a political framework, that may work for who you want to vote for. That's fine if that's what you want to do. But it goes beyond that. Now, what I'd like to start with is Emily on that particular point. And if you would talk about the book, what was the purpose behind the book? What were you trying to do? What were we trying to do?
Yeah, first of all, before I launch into that, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge each and every one of you who have chosen to be here today. Knowing what's happening politically, knowing that there are threats to the Jewish community, and here you are, whether you're Jewish or not, attending in a synagogue, very hot topic and event in support of changing the narrative and the stories that are promoting anti-Semitism. And it takes great courage and bravery for you to be here today, and I'm really grateful, and I just want to say thank you. So I'm the child of survivors, and there was an attempted genocide that occurred in Iraq, and my family's been in Babylon since the beginning of time, since 500 BC, when the Jewish population first started. So we've been there for thousands of years and many generations. By the time my parents were there, Jews made up about 1% of the population in Iraq. Yet there was the Ba'ath Party who came to power, and that was a fascist regime headed by Saddam Hussein. And this person, a villain, wanted to seize control. And people were feeling disenfranchised. People who had some kind of victim mentality or schema, that was able to be exploited by a ruler who was able to say, that person over there or that group over there is the cause of all of your problems. And And it worked. Unfortunately, it was within a day, people who were living as neighbors, cohabitating with my family, they were business partners. They lived together. They went to school together. One of my mother's best friends was a Muslim girl. The night before my mother escaped, they went and cried to each other in silence without even sharing why or what or where they were going to go, because they knew that they couldn't speak about it. The Secret Service abducted my grandfather, my mother's father. He was taken to a prison that was called the Palace of No Return, because once you went in, there was no story or information or details about what had happened to you. And when we hear of the stories of the hostages taken today and no information of what's happening, whether they're alive or dead, or whether we can have their bodies so we can give them a proper burial, Israel will stop at nothing to exchange live prisoners for a deceased Israeli soldier or a deceased Israeli. So this is how important it is. And my father and his brothers went through the Kurdish mountains. They were smuggled. They sought refuge in Iran. My mother and her siblings had to go out through various routes, and they sought refuge in Israel. All of this is to say, how does this happen? How is it that people who one day are your friends or your schoolmates, your business partners, your neighbors, just suddenly turn on you in a day? These relationships existed. And my argument, Paul and I write this book about it, that it's ideological, it's radicalized, it's not a mental disorder, it's not a psychological disorder. And this is what's happening today. And we've gone around the world. We did a trip recently to Bosnia. We met with political and community leaders there, spoke to them about what had happened during the Bosnian genocide. We see this replicated time and time again. This is not new. In 1941, there was the Farhud, the violent dispossession. We saw women who were pregnant, their bellies were cut open. Babies, their heads were smashed in. Hundreds of people were murdered. Women were raped. Jewish women were raped. Their breasts were cut off and mutilated. This is what happened on October 7th. So we're seeing this replicated. What happened October 7th is not new. This happened historically across time and to the Jewish community, unfortunately, as it's a repeated event. The question is, what is the narrative that is happening here, and how are we supporting it, and how do we speak up against it? And it comes back down to that radicalization and the ideology. The thesis in our book is, 1, extremism, genocide, terrorism are all linked to ideology. Not all ideologies are necessarily bad, but the ones that become violent are the ones that separate groups into the oppressed and the oppressor. What happens in that pathway is that people then dehumanize, objectify other people, and then that lends itself to justifying these inhumane acts of terror, which we've seen on October 7th.
All right, so think about this for a moment. The right and the left, we were just talking about it a moment ago. I don't care if you're talking about the Proud Boys on one side or what's going on college campuses today. There's this framework that begins to be formed in their mind that says, hey, I'm a victim and that I've been oppressed. And so all of a sudden you gain this worldview of that's how all power works. Now, I'm going to give you my experience in power. That's not how power works, right? Imagine this. You go into you take 2 people that are out of a tribe, and one person goes out and catches a big buffalo, brings it back, cuts up the buffalo, puts the buffalo skin on his back, shares the meat with just him and his family. The other guy comes back with a smaller buffalo. The smaller buffalo, he says, hey, when you cut that skin off, take it over there to those sick people. And then when you cut this food up, make certain you feed those children and those old people first. And then what's left, we'll split it up amongst the warriors. Which one do you think gets leadership? All right, here's the point. In my experience, the leader's not the oppressor. It's just not true, right? But if your view of power is that all power is oppressive, then obviously the only thing that's left is how do you reverse that totem pole? How do you get the power that's on top of it? And you begin to think that you get that power through oppressing the other side. When that happens and you objectify people, you are one step away from violence. Now, because we're here to talk about jihadism, and by the way, that can be true with communism, that can be true with what happened with the Soviet Revolution, that can happen with a variety of things. But we're here to talk about jihadism. So if you can, as psychologists, help me understand, how do you see jihadism? What actually is it? And I'll start with you, Doctor.
Sure. So we have to start with the word itself means the struggle, right? So there's a lot of our friends and neighbors who practice Islam that see it as what we might call in Christianity spiritual warfare. It's a very benign, the internal side, all right? But we know in the last 40 or 50 years, a strain of Islam has started. We talk about Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood. Did that just, all right. The Muslim Brotherhood, and it's a new interpretation that says it needs to be taken out and into the world to conquer people, to spread Islam by the sword. I think in America in particular, we get kind of a mixture of those two things, right? We don't have, so working for the Sheriff's Department, I'm a task force officer for the local FBI, JTTF, we don't see folks that are very clearly Shia or Sunni. We don't see people that understand the difference even if you go into jails. They're radicalized to a kind of Islam, but they're not understanding the thousands of years of history in the Middle East. So people will attach themselves to this idea of struggle. And in the modern world, where all this stuff is a click or two away, they just end up down a rabbit hole on it. I believe one of the things that's particularly compelling, you guys talk about hijacking the amygdala, right? This is all, ideology is emotional, it's persuasive, and when we don't have a clear ideology to pursue, if you're young, you're dispossessed, how different is some of the early phases of radicalization to Islam? How different is that from, say, joining a local street gang, right? You're finding your tribe, your people to work with. I can say this because of the amount of time I spent in the military. How different is that than going through Marine Corps boot camp, right? I can say that the Marines are radicals, right? So the way that jihad and Islam has been interfaced with in America is almost primarily through the lens of 9/11 and violence and extremism. And we could actually we saw after 9/11, we did a poor job of explaining who our neighbors were, that were very equally hurt and offended by 9/11. So one thing to think about the global struggle that has to do with jihadism and Islamic terrorism, and who's the most numeric victim of this? It's other Muslims, right? So this is not sort of a healthy, its plan is to menace, its plan is to influence. We just in our lifetime have seen things like 9/11 and the new caliphate.
Yeah, there's definitely there are 2 billion Muslims on the planet, and I have a number of them that I really do count as being friends. They do not all buy into jihadism. In fact, it's a very, very small percentage that do. But there is also this cognitive dissonance issue that comes into play where all of us are attracted by our tribe.
I should have said the Salafi, extremists, the stuff promoted by Saudi Arabia to some degree. They even kicked it out of their own country, right? They have the madrasas in Pakistan. The folks that we ended up fighting on my 2 trips to Afghanistan were folks that were part of that Salafist strain that, for the most part, Saudi Arabia tries to keep out of their own country, but they've sent it other places with the schools. We don't have a ton of that really here in America. What you'll see in America, and I'll just, another group that I work with as a researcher is Parents for Peace, and we have parents and communities come to us with usually kids, right? Amazingly, this is happening in 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. The more recent things you can think of is if you heard the NYPD, actually very new officer, was stabbed on New Year's Eve by a young kid, I think from Maine, who was quote unquote a jihadist. Okay, this young man had never met another Muslim. He didn't really even know what he was practicing. Something about the anger, the cause, the righteousness. We even find at Parents for Peace that the younger they get, the more we're seeing kiddos who have sort of autism spectrum traits, right? And the best I can tell you from that is compared to, your parents maybe going to the local mega church, right, where everything's sort of free form and there's music, the rigidity of it, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, do these 5 things, right? So, I don't think there's any particular over association of any of these things with autism or jihad. There's no obvious connection, but some of the kids you'll see in your community that may end up getting attached to this, it's just they might be getting picked on a little bit at school, but now, as of even 20 years ago, where you'd have to really go looking for a jihadist, you 2 or 3 clicks away.
Yep. All right, Emily, you have spent a lot of time in prison. I hate having to say that. It's always, I feel like it needs an explanation, but nonetheless.
They let me out.
Yeah, they let you out. Dealing with people on an eye-to-eye level that have been in a variety of radical groups. Help us, if you can, understand jihadism better from your perspective.
Yeah, so homegrown terrorism in the U.S. is very different from what we're talking about in Gaza. I'll do a comparison in a moment, but let me just paint the picture. Doing forensic psychology, my task is to spend a day with a murderer or somebody who's facing charges of domestic terrorism or capital crimes or sometimes extremism. So some of the people that I'm seeing are incel members, and they're not unlike what we see in terms of homegrown terrorists either. The similarities are that they see themselves as a victim. They have this grievance. They feel like they're being oppressed. And there is this dehumanization and objectification of this other group.
That's perfect, by the way. Compare the incel to the jihadist and explain what incel actually is as you're doing that.
Yeah, so involuntary celibates are young, white, heterosexual males who feel that they've been reverse raped by young, attractive women, and they're angry that all these attractive guys are getting all the girls and they're not getting any sex. They're being rejected based on a defect, a social defect, a mental illness, and that is causing them to justify raping women and committing mass murder crimes, and sometimes it's a suicidal mission too. That they're suicidal and homicidal. That is also not unlike what you see with jihadists, because their whole motive, as Dr. Schumacher was saying, like kill and die for jihad, for this holy war, for this cause, and you are martyred as a result. With a jihadist, the group that they're perpetrating against or towards are Jews, Israel, Western values, and it could be other Muslims who are not practicing to the level of their own radicalized faith as well. So what you see are similarities, and it is a radical ideology that is driving and perpetuating these actions and these behaviors. Now, as we were talking earlier about these clicks, they're only like 1 or 2 clicks away, and Dr. Schumacher was talking about some of these vulnerabilities that is incentivizing them to be radicalized online. But the majority in the US of these people, incel members, homegrown terrorists, are being recruited online. I think the number is like 80% at the moment. So it's so important. What I see, it's once their family members learn about what has happened and these recruitments and what is going on online, they're shocked. They're appalled. This isn't my child. This isn't my son. What has happened? How did they get here?
Including Muslim families.
Including Muslim families. They're like, this is a dishonor. This is not an honor. And they're doing everything to protect them. And they're terrified about what has happened. Same thing with incel members. The family members are shocked. The parents come in. How did this happen?
Talk about the recruiter a little bit, if you would.
So that's the dark triad is the type of personality that is this recruiter. They're Machiavellian, they're psychopaths, and they have narcissistic traits. These are the recruiters that are online. Now, the difference between what is happening here in the US versus, say, in Gaza is that it is state-sponsored terrorism in Gaza. What that means is Hamas is promoting jihad. That is in their doctrines. That they control the government. They control the educational system. They control the religious structure. Right now we have the video playing for Group 1. the people in there, if they're staying for the full video, they're going to see one of the terrorists who go in after they've committed murder of innocent children and women and men. They call home. Mom, Dad, you'll never guess what happened. I killed 3 Jews today. And they're on the other end of the phone. Oh, son, we're so proud of you. This is how it's become so much a part of their worldview, how they see the world. You cannot de-radicalize somebody, especially when it's become so institutionalized at that level that has happened in Gaza. When they're bringing the hostages and parading them down the street, you'll see videos. People are cheering, they're celebrating, they're dancing. Yay, we got a Jewish hostage. And this is an 80-year-old woman who's a Holocaust survivor in a wheelchair, and they're celebrating that. So you really have to consider, what is the mentality of the people who are supporting this, and how is it different from state-sponsored terrorism?
Dr. Schumacher, talk a little bit about this, because you've seen both sides. The idea that, to me, the idea that I think is important in this is we worry about domestic terrorism all the time, but it isn't even close to what you see happening in a place like Gaza. In Gaza, they control all the strings. They control the media, the educational system, everything else. Here, for the most part, if you're radicalized, the rest of the community really doesn't want you to be. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, agreed. Until recently, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, where we've seen a little bit more mob-like behavior, and the kind of groups that are maybe coming together in person. The preponderance of the folks that have become radicalized in the U.S. and as you said, 80% or more of these folks are they're relatively isolated. When I see at Parents for Peace and through the Sheriff's Department, most of these folks that we get tipped off to that this person's radicalized or they've made a threat to somebody at a school, I can translate this a couple of ways that might be helpful. The first one is that maybe 20 years ago when we were training in psychology, it was, if you don't let me go see my boyfriend, I'm gonna kill myself. Now it's, I'm gonna shoot up the school. And why they're gonna shoot up the school is because they've seen it on TV, they've got their grievances, so there's something sort of odd in the culture where people, kiddos get distressed, right? They're not automatically, they're not automatically gonna look to shoot up a school, but there's that meme out there. You guys call it addictive ideologies. I'd call some of these things sticky, right? There's a well-known suicide contagion effect, whereas people see this, it does perhaps give them the idea. There's a lot of mimicry, a lot of copycatting. One of the papers I wrote with a mentor of mine, Reed Malloy, we kind of hypothesized that you see these manifestos for these one-off mass shooters that if you watch through this, and we've got a friend, a colleague, Julia Kupper, who is a forensic linguist, you can sort of see them replicating it. It's like verbal DNA, right? It's copying itself, and as the person writes out their own manifesto, they're becoming more radicalized, they're moving down the pathway to violence, right? This is utterly separate from something like combined arms, military planned terrorist attacks, right? We don't have ETA, if you remember the Spanish government. We don't have the IRA here. We don't have anything like Al-Qaeda. Even when we had Al-Qaeda, we had small, very small cells to avoid detection, right? So the difference is on the level of crowds with hundreds and more years of history. At home, I started my career actually as a suicidologist. That's my expertise is psychiatric emergencies. I got into terrorism because if we can even remember back then, the suicidal terrorist was the norm, or at least what we saw in the early 2000s. The world's changed dramatically. One more little example about that is that in LA, we've had a couple of fairly prominent incidents, people shooting folks coming out of synagogue. That was an Asian guy who, and this is incredibly racist, but they call themselves rice cells. So they're not the white incels, they're folks of Asian descent who view things like the stereotypes that Asian men can't date white women, where white men will often like to date Asian women, and they talk about height and weight, and I mean it's a whole rabbit hole you can get down because these things are sticky, and I think the key to ideology is, in America especially, but ideology and identity go together, right?
Transition for me to Gaza.
Yeah.
And think about when a government does have the control over those levers, what's the hope? Is there hope for Gaza in your mind?
You know, it's hard to talk about Gaza. I mean, I know of little programs here and there, right? I know of people that go and Palestinian youngsters meet Israeli youngsters, and some of the Israeli youngsters are obviously, Arab and Palestinian themselves. And this is a very long, slow work of doing de-radicalization, doing, desensitization. One thing I want to say about the hope that there is in this is just to think more clearly. Like, let's say it were January of 2002, 6 months after 9/11. Would anybody have a problem with regime change? Mm-hmm. I mean, Israel can't get their response in. There are literally human beings still in captivity, including Americans. The word regime change is just out. We did that for 20 years with two different countries. So you've got to kind of look at the way the propaganda, and this is why I started by saying that terrorism in the modern age is about ideology and it's about influence, right? Within 3 months, I think we would all agree that somehow the world went from supporting Israel because they've been hit by a horrible terror attack to being completely, how long did that take for the Americans, for us as Americans after 9/11? I mean, we did 10 years, 15 years before there was any real pushback at all. So partly you have to look at the way terrorism has morphed from, I mean, sorry to say, the reason why there may be very little hope for Gaza itself right now is just because the attack was so much more effective even than 9/11 in influencing behavior. So the Israeli government in particular has I can't think of a more sticky problem. And by the way, that's all intentional, right? I used to work with special forces, so small groups trying to have an oversized impact. That was we'll study that for 20 years. It was extremely effective. You just have you just got to be objective about it. They did an extremely good job of putting Israel in an impossible position.
Mm-hmm. All right, Emily, so you haven't spent time in Gaza, obviously, but I'd like to know from your perspective, thinking about the people that you've worked with, what do you see as being the hope for Gazans? And by the way, I think it is reasonable for all of us to want the Muslims in Gaza to be successful, but we just simply don't want to have to live with the current ideology that says that it's okay to go in and not only murder, but I think they would commit a genocide if they could. My question, though, is what do you think the chance is for them of being able to create the reforms that are necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think globally it begs the question of trust. Like, can we still trust a group, even if you dismantle Hamas, looking at the people of Gaza? And I think that there's a lot of good theory out there that says that there's a pathway towards extremist violence. And if we see societies that are corrupted by these worldviews that have already adopted this ideology, dehumanized this outgroup, objectified this outgroup, it's not like you can just help them to see the world and shape and inform that we all coexist as humans and let's be compassionate to each other.
What success have you had at being able to get people out of radicalization?
If people are all the way on that radical extreme end, that they're endorsing and participating in extremist forms of violence, it is not possible to de-radicalize them. You have to get them at their infancy stages if you want to have any kind of effective result.
And to be clear, even when you catch them earlier, what you don't do is argue with the ideology, right? So when we say de-radicalization, what we really find is we meet disengagement. We try to take them out of the gang, take them out of the group, or if they're...
I think it was Bellinger who made the comment that if you, and she was, I mean, you can utilize this for, I don't care, pick a group, the MAGA group, a jihadist, an incel member, left-wing groups. If you try to confront them with facts or experts, I believe they actually become more violent.
Right. They resist, they react, they get angry. Exactly. They're not. This is not like having a head-to-head dialogue about this is not a great approach. And I'll give you a kind of quirky example because again, I live in LA, so the world's a little bit more mixed and diverse. The largest group of QAnon adherents that we had in LA were actually yoga moms. people that were sort of previously like anti-vax. They didn't want their kids to get autism from the vaccines, and so they ended up all the way down the QAnon hole. And by the way, when's the last time anyone heard anything about QAnon? Just poof, gone, right? So these things are partly part of the digital world, but they're very promiscuous ideologies. Is that the way to say it? I mean, people attach to what they attach to, and it often, well, it's not rational to begin with, right? So it doesn't make sense to address it on a rational level.
All right, so let me take us back, and I'll start this with Emily. I want to go back to the college campuses that we were talking about earlier. And what I'm trying to figure out, even in my mind, is how do I compare them to what I just saw on the screen? How do I compare what's happening on our college campuses with students who are yelling at Jewish students who are walking by to these guys who are out walking on the street saying Jews will not replace us?
Yeah, they've already adopted the ideology of the oppressed versus the oppressors.
They,
So
the college students?
they, the college students, those who are rioting, protesting, demonstrating for the pure reason to intimidate or harass or threaten or discourage Jewish students on campuses. And I think it's, in some cases, in many cases, it's even being supported by the theory that is being taught in the colleges, as well as what the administrations are supporting, what the professors might be supporting, that they're seeing themselves already as a victim, and now they're giving the theory to separate groups and objectify these groups based on this construct of seeing one as the oppressed by an oppressor. And it's
Do I
this
have to worry about
perception
them
of
becoming
power.
violent?
So I think this is also influenced by them wanting to feel superior and gain power, but not through ways that are going to be more pro-social. And it's extremely provocative and confrontational, and they're one step away from violence. I think we do need to be seriously concerned. I'm seriously concerned about violence erupting on college campuses because they're already there. We've already
You say
seen
they're already
the
there,
pathway.
meaning
They've adopted the ideology.
They're already objectifying the other group.
Yes, all the anti-Semitism, and now it's being supported and condoned by the administration, and they have all the reason to now be angry and direct their hate and anger and resentment towards a group who is now the Jews. And yeah, they're objectifying them, and I think it's just going to take a little bit more before it erupts to violence. They're already down that pathway.
Yeah, like I said, I live in LA, and we watched what happened with Black Lives Matter, right? And okay, I'll tell you, from the view from LA, California, is that there's pretty much a direct through line from Black Lives Matter to the same folks protesting now. There's just really no way around it. When we talk about this paradox, right? I'm largely of Christian background, and so that means my rabbi wears flip-flops, right? So whenever we try to do a historical Jesus thing these days, people kind of get uptight because Jesus doesn't look like me, right? He's not a white guy with blonde hair and blue eyes, right? But now somehow Israel is a white colonial. This stuff doesn't really make sense, right? But you will see, and we saw this. We saw this when Roe versus Wade was repealed. We saw the same kinds of characters, and there's a small subset of very professional, very aggressive protesters, right? They often wear black bloc stuff. They're often instigating. There was an incident in West LA. We have a veterans cemetery, and there was a huge protest about the time President Biden went out there for a fundraiser. So they said spray painted "Free Gaza" on the military cemetery. Okay, why? Then someone in very sort of tactical gear, black bloc, came in and they sprayed a red triangle on there. Do we know what the red triangle is supposed to mean? It's one of the symbols that were worn in the Holocaust camps.
Okay.
Right? So someone's taken what seems to be a largely peaceful protest. We may or may not agree with what they think. That's part of America, right? The police job is to keep everybody safe. Well, the police watch them spray paint. So first off, we kind of let this go as it's getting into more violent and destructive. And then we let someone come by and create a hate crime. That's a hate crime. To put an anti-Semitic symbol like that, in a neighborhood that has a lot of Jews in it, right? That's a hate crime. It doesn't get prosecuted. They don't go grab that person. So there's a degree to which you can also put up hard stops, right? So I agree with you that just like after George Floyd, there's the potential for those groups to get dangerous and mob-like. But I went outside my building in downtown LA that day and walked into a crowd of people, almost all black, and said, "What's going on?" Because they're like, "Oh, peaceful protest," and they meant it, right? I mean, there was no intent to be violent. So we have to look at that flip, right, where it maybe is turning to more violence, or it might be getting that momentum, and we have to, like, you know, enforce the law, right? There's lines. You can't vandalize. You can't engage in hate speech of people. And this is my last little caveat on that. Between the Jewish Federation, the Safe Communities Network, I hope you guys are all well aware of what they do, because they're doing a lot of the job that maybe police and even the FBI should be doing at the level of this early threats, early speech, early hate speech, right? Because you have to stand against it a little bit. You got to stop it where it starts. You can't let it go until people are all frothing and not making any sense anymore.
Yeah, it's fascinating because when you think about, in listening to my Jewish in-laws and in listening to many members of the Jewish community, you can't actually say that where Nazi Germany was, but you can say that there are similar things happening that led to where Nazi Germany ended up. Both sides beginning to objectify different people. So I now want to go, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to hit on the solution. And I'm going to give a brief editorial on this one, but I want to hear your positions. So to me, one of the single biggest issues is the common narrative of the United States, the cause, the common narrative of Israel. And the common narrative is this: we see one another as individuals. We should look at other people and we should judge them by the content of their character, not by what group they belong to, nor should they look at us based upon what group we belong to. But in doing that, we play a role too. We play a role in promoting this. Each one of us play a role in advocating something that can become worse. Emily, I'll start with you. Solutions that you think that may help us find our way through this from a psychological standpoint, and then Dr. Schumacher, I'll give you the final comment.
Yeah, we have to watch what we think. We have to be aware of our thoughts, and we are not immune to objectifying others as well. We were talking about the amygdala hijack earlier. There's a lot of psychological processes that happen to simplify threat. And when we're feeling threatened, it's a very quick trigger for us. And automatically we want to find out, are you friend or foe? Which category do you belong in? And we do this rapidly, quickly. It's these quick heuristics that work in our brain. But we have to catch ourselves when we're doing this. We have to take accountability for ourselves. Evil can exist within us. We can also perpetuate it. And so taking responsibility for that is just as important. Be courageous. Have some of these difficult conversations. All of you have made a choice to be here today. Please have conversations. Tell another 10 people about what you learned from attending today's seminar. Please promote it. And individualism and Western values are very sacred. They come at a great cost. People lost their lives to provide what we have. I know firsthand as a daughter of survivors what my life would have been like had I lived under a dictatorship rule in Iraq. I would not be a psychologist. I would not be a female who owns property, who runs a business, and all these other things. These are privileges that I get to afford here because this country believes in protecting those values, and it has to be defended. Paul and I, in our book, we wrote about 7 different ideals, and I think the other one that I just want to highlight is really know your purpose. Your purpose and meaning is going to be an important driving factor. After Paul went to Israel with a group of people, this manifested as a result of how he was transformed by what he watched and saw and took place and observed. And I think that is amazing. I think if we can all do that and participate in practice, good will triumph. And this is what we hope for today. Last piece, please be aware of what you watch. There's so much misinformation and skewed propaganda, political propaganda. Unfortunately, I feel like Hamas is winning the propaganda war and Israel is losing it. I'm hoping that turns around soon. But Israel definitely needs help, and as well as Judaism. But be aware of what you watch and what you're promoting.
Dr. Schumacher.
I'm going to start, at the high level, the sort of geopolitical level, and agree with what you just said. It's not just that Hamas and the movement is winning; it's they're winning big. So in the days after October 7, it was something like a 3-to-1 increase in bots and other forms of propaganda on the side of Hamas. In other words, it was planned before the event, right? So this is all very intentional, and as a military man, you can pull me aside if you want to talk about this kind of influence warfare at the level of cyber operations. We're terrible at it. We have an open society. We allow a lot of free speech, and that gets taken advantage of. So as a guy that's been in the global war on terror for the better part of 17, 18 years now, I can tell you we have to rethink what we're doing. We're not winning.
Thank you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.